Today, we take focus on the BIASHARA Summit or conference that is holding in Kigali, Rwanda, and we are bringing again to the fore the place of the African Continental Free Trade Area. Welcome, of course. It will be another exciting episode where we'll focus on the economic integration in Africa and trade, which is being reverberated at the BIASHARA Africa Forum 2024, the second edition, hosted in Kigali's Rwanda's capital city, Kigali. That stands, of course, as a testament to Africa's historic vision of uniting its markets and fostering intra-Africa trade. Presidents, head of entrepreneurs and policymakers continue to explore the scope and the unique opportunity on how the African Continental Free Trade Area can practically reshape regional value chains, enhance trade dialogue, and ultimately stimulate economic growth, especially in the ever-changing and challenging world of today, notably with a market of 1.3 billion people and a combined GDP of $3.4 trillion. The potential to reduce poverty and create jobs is immense with the historic African Continental Free Trade Area, AfCFTA. However, significant challenges remain, which include trade barriers, logistic costs, and governance issues, among others, that continue to hinder progress. But now the problematic we ask is what age, therefore, for the African Continental Free Trade Area, particularly in this contemporary society where a lot of changes are happening and countries or nations are now defining new initiatives or perspectives on how to actually position themselves to benefit from the globalization and other changes occurring. Now we are looking at the place of Africa under the banner of the African Continental Free Trade Area. Ladies and gentlemen, it is going to be a discursive program with a panel of experts for us to understand fully the place of this Continental Free Trade Area and what scope of opportunities lie ahead for the continent to boost economic integration, which according to some stakeholders attending the BIASHARA Forum second edition in Rwanda, Kigali, have highlighted that this has the capacity to facelift the economic trajectory of Africa and also lift the population out of poverty. Thank you once more. Without much ado, we're going straight away to introducing the panel this day, and to Ghana, the country that is hosting the Secretariat of the African Continental Free Trade Area. We want to acknowledge the presence of Mr. FIDEL OWUSU, who is an international relations expert who doubles as a security analyst, and we are glad to have you this day on Global Insight. Mr. OWUSU. Looking forward, of course, to having a fruitful discussion. And of course, joining us from the United States of America will be Professor David MONDA, also international relations expert. And of course, he's of Kenyan nationality, but he'll be joining us from the United States of America. If you're already there, Professor MONDA, I want to take this opportunity to say welcome to you.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
It's always a pleasure, and we appreciate your time to give us your, insight on our topic for discussion, which is discussing the edge of the African Continental Free Trade Area under the banner of BIASHARA 2024, and of course, in a very changing world with a lot to handle. The stakes are high. But before we enter into analyzing this, I will invite us to listen to, of course, the vision of Dare to Invent in a New Africa as we listen, and then I'll join you right after that.
ever imagined what it truly means to unify a continent? What it means to live in Africa where no one is left behind? This isn't a dream, it's our reality. We are daring to invent our future where our borders are invisible, divisions are obsolete, where we move as one to our own beat. Our products will find markets with each other. We will settle payments swiftly and securely. Our services will move across borders as easily as our ideas. Our businesses will scale with ease. Our women and girls will thrive, breaking barriers and leading the church on innovation. Our youth will unite across borders with seamless travel. And yes, they will lead, not just sit at the proverbial table. As we said, this is no longer a dream. In 2018, in this very room, we united to rewrite the rules of trade. We have since established the rules of origin and the Pan-African payments and settlement system, which are critical for fostering intra-Africa trade. Initiatives like the AfCFTA guided trade initiatives have already started paving the way to tangible trade across borders, including Cameroon, Ghana, South Africa, Kenya, and Rwanda. We are creating a market of innovation, growth, and opportunity, one where every African can rise to their fullest potential. AfCFTA is more than an agreement. It's the embodiment of Africa's resilience, unity, and vision. We dare to invent the future, and we have succeeded. This is our journey. This is your journey. Let's own it together and continue to create the Africa we have.
Indeed, dare to invent the Africa we want. The words which are resounding in the Rwanda's capital city, Kigali, as stakeholders, presidents, former head of state, and incumbents with other stakeholders gather to discuss indeed the scope and opportunity for the continent under the historic milestone that is the African Continental Free Trade Area. We want to go holistically to revisit the preamble of this historic project, which has the capacity to change things around for the continent Africa, with you, Professor MONDA, and of course wanting to have what you have to say about the edge of this historic trade in African Continental Free Trade Area this time around, that the world is witnessing drastic changes.
Yeah, I think it's a moment for reflection. The original agreement was signed in 2018 in Kigali, Rwanda, the seat of today's meeting, and I think it's a question of reflection on the opportunities, but also the challenges of the African Continental Free Trade Area. It's the largest free trade agreement in terms of area, but also in terms of the countries that participate within the area. It has incredible potential in terms of integrating the economies of the continent, in terms of scaling the production of the different regional economic free trade areas, the regional economic communities. But I think we have to be honest and admit that this agreement comes with significant challenges. And among these are questions of political instability within different countries and regions of the continent, issues of distrust among the different member countries, which lead to lack of seriousness in terms of enforcing some of the agreements. We also know that infrastructure is a huge problem on the continent, and it's something that will really need to be looked into. So it's a really interesting time for reflection in terms of the opportunities available, but also some of the challenges that are coming up.
and which is very imperative at this particular moment, that in 2018, the zest was high among countries as we saw the signing and ratification of the treaties, of course, of the African Continental Free Trade Area. But then we continue to face challenges, and that is where I want you to maybe open up this session with Mr. OWUSU, because stakeholders, delegates are more concerned in Kigali about resolving some of these challenges, especially the major challenges which are actually impeding the practicality or operationalization of this gigantic or historical continental free trade area that has the capacity to boost the economic integration of the African continent.
Yeah, thank you very much for this opportunity once again. I would like to say that the challenges that prevented African countries to synchronize their economies, remove trade barriers, and to work towards a common market have been there for a long time. In fact, in the 1950s and the 1960s, when the founding fathers of the various states were pushing for a united Africa, they were talking about a single market, a single currency, that if you were a Ghanaian businessman and you wanted to go to Kampala, there should be no trade blocks, and things like that were mentioned. But then again, we had challenges that had to do with the uniqueness of individual states, the different colonial experience, the kind of economic structure that we had, that many African countries had similar economic structures. And so it looked like trading among themselves was quite not interesting to some people, because then African countries were majority primary producers. And so even when countries like Ghana and others were implementing what was known as import substitution industrialization, it did not make much difference in the bigger frame of things. And so I believe that these challenges have been there, and it's because of these challenges that countries were even not enthusiastic enough in the 70s, 80s, and the early 90s to pursue this project. So in 2018, when finally we decided to start this, it was a watershed moment. Many people were surprised. In fact, people thought that this was impossible. And even after that, not so many countries were ready to jump on that. So a country like Nigeria had 8 problems and challenges. It was not willing to just join. It took some negotiations and some talks for Nigeria to actually join, because it felt that the smaller economies around it could take advantage of 8 huge markets, and perhaps it will be a zero-sum game for it. But after some talks, Nigeria decided to jump on, and being one of the largest economies on the continent, that was very positive. Yeah. But just as Prof has mentioned, there are a lot of challenges that still persist.
Over 400 million Africans live in extreme and moderate poverty.
Well, I can hear.
No, go on, Mr. OWUSU.
As a security analyst, I'm also even talking about the issue of extremism, terrorism, the issue of insecurity, rebellions. You go to Ethiopia, one of the 5 largest economies on the continent, and you realize the issue of conflict, domestic conflict. You are talking about Kenya, a very robust economy that is threatened with terrorism that is coming from Somalia. And so, and Somalia itself as a country that is still, struggling to emerge. So then all these are challenges, because in the midst of insecurity, it is very difficult for trade to happen. The kind of trade that Ghana has with Burkina Faso, where Ghana imports so much tomatoes from Burkina Faso, can be disrupted if the current issue of terrorism is not well addressed. So these are some of the challenges that need to be addressed for the African Continental Free Trade Agreement to actually have some consequential impact on the people who are the ordinary people in Africa. Thank you.
Indeed, of course, we're looking at how this can change the situation of the vulnerable people across the continent. I would love to stay with you, Mr. OWUSU, and of course, it was intentional about starting off with the challenges, because that's what actually is derailing. And according to some pundits, the challenges somehow natural and others are man-made. And we will note that since you talked from the security point of view, since the ratification, and let's say it was in 2020, there was too much excitement and anxiety about the operationalization of this historic free trade agreement. But then we discovered that the continent was overwhelmed from that time. It was also a year to put an end to proliferation of small arms into the African continent. But we'll note that since that time till date, the number of conflicts or security threats have increased across the African continent. Now we are looking at some strategic challenges that come as a result of the third party wanting to derail the process of the real implementation of the African Continental Free Trade Area, knowing fully well its capacity and what it has to do with the economic trajectory of the African continent, and also the philosophy of economic integration. Now, conversant with all of these, how can we now tackle this strategically to come back to the path for seeing the realization of this gigantic project?
Yeah, firstly, I scripted a summary a few days ago, I think yesterday, that was yesterday, and I mentioned that 5 of the largest economies on the continent, be Nigeria, South Africa, Algeria, Ethiopia, and Egypt, have half or make up of half of the GDP of the entire continent. So it means that those 5 countries cover half of the GDP of the whole of Africa. And the rest of the continent has we are talking about 49 other countries. Then I have the rest of the half, that is about $1.4 trillion. And so then we cannot pretend that all countries in Africa are equal. In fact, even after the 5, countries like Kenya and Morocco are also close and having very significant economies. Now, my argument is that the smaller economies should allow the larger ones to lead in order to create the necessary vortex that pulls them along in order to have a very consequential continental unity in terms of trade. Because if Togo, with its smaller, relatively small economy, would have the same weight or the same say as Nigeria, then we will be pretending for a long time, but we will not see some tangible changes on the ground. So we must, just like we have in the European Union, where Germany, France, and Italy, the 3 largest economy in the Union, seem to create that vortex for the smaller ones to go along. We have to do that. That is first. Second, when it comes to security leadership, stronger economies should also take larger roles. For instance, if you are in West Africa, Nigeria has the largest military and spend more in its security. So it is not in the interest of Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger to alienate Nigeria or to push away Nigeria. It is important that Nigeria becomes a role player or an important player in the security goals of the West African region, so that extremism in the Sahel needs to involve Nigeria in solving it. That is why the recent agreement between Nigeria and Niger, despite some disagreement in the past month, is a good call, where the 2 military chiefs came together to sign an agreement to cooperate in order to fight terrorism. That is very important. Now, if you move to the Horn of Africa, the role of Kenya and Ethiopia, these are very experienced militaries that could help bring stability. And that is the reason why the kind of border dispute and territorial dispute between Somalia and Ethiopia is needless. So these, and you're talking of Southern Africa, you are talking of South Africa, how South Africa can pull Namibia, Botswana, Mozambique, and others along. Algeria, Egypt can also do similar in the regions that they find themselves. And fortunately for us, these countries, these 5 countries, are not close to each other. They are somehow evenly distributed across the continent. And so we can take advantage of that. Now, apart from that, talking about increasing security problems. Yes, as states exist, you keep having problems. But what makes the difference is how they are tackled. And as I'm saying, we cannot pretend to be being individualistic as states in solving our problems when we need others or the problems within our borders affect others. Let's consider what is happening in Eastern DRC. The effect it has on Uganda, Rwanda, Burundi, and other neighboring states.
Yeah.
So in solving it, you need all others on board. Look, trade, the economic progress happens in a stable environment. We should not forget that. So as long as if we do not get our stability right, our security right, it will be difficult to get the economic facet right.
Okay.
If the lady who farms in DRC and sells her produce in Uganda does not have a peaceful environment to do so, she's not going to gain from the free trade agreement that we have signed. So we must prioritize security. And that is why the hosting of this particular program in Rwanda is very important. The prioritization of peace between Rwanda and DRC should be paramount. And we have seen what is happening where Angola is becoming a mediator in this conflict. We should give Angola more room to operate in order to bring peace, bring them to the peace table. In Egypt and Ethiopia, these are 2 giants that are fighting over the Nile. We must resolve that crisis.
Absolutely.
That will let us have consequential trade amongst ourselves. So what I'm trying to say is that the stability, security stability, is a sine qua non to economic progress. Without that, it will be difficult for us to achieve it. And that is my security point of view. Thank you.
Indeed, very imperative, of course, solving the problem from the roots or the basis. We eventually solve the major problem. I would love to have your input, of course, Professor MONDA, on this aspect of security and how it is, impeding the steady implementation or operationalization of the historic African continental free trade area for the real economic integration of Africa.
Yeah, I think as has previously been stated, I think security is definitely a major determinant and a major inhibitor to trade. As a previous speaker has said, if you look at the example of the DRC, the potential of the DRC, not only in terms of the size of the DRC economy, but the ability of the DRC to provide a whole range of natural minerals, a huge market, an area that really needs to be developed. But large parts of the DRC are inaccessible because of the infrastructure, the poor infrastructure or lack of infrastructure in the DRC. And this is very much tied to the insecurity, because part of the reason you have all these wars in the Great Lakes region, in DRC's border areas, is the infiltration of the DRC's borders by rebel groups from outside the country and also from within the DRC. And the DRC government cannot respond because of poor infrastructure. So a lot of these issues are very much intertwined. When we talk about insecurity, when we talk about some of these perennial civil wars in areas like the Great Lakes region, insecurity in Somalia, a lot of these have to do with questions about infrastructure, But we cannot talk about political stability without talking about questions of good governance.
Sure.
And here we have to address the issue of the structures and systems within the African Union, the regional economic communities, regional security networks, to try and deal with some of these political instabilities, because you cannot have regional integration, you cannot have mobility of human capital, right? Migratory questions, ease of movement of people. People will not want to move to areas where there's instability. So I think these are really, other issues that we need to think about. But I must add, in addition to the, political instability, are other questions of non-tariff barriers. So, for example, if I'm a Kenyan lawyer and I want to practice in Nigeria, or I'm a Nigerian lawyer and I want to practice in Gabon or Cameroon, will my law degree be accepted across the borders, right? Will there be reciprocity? That's another element of integration that, that needs to be addressed. The ease of movement of human capital, of migration, the ease of movement of people, the ability for a Cameroonian to work in Nigeria, or a Nigerian to work in Kenya, or a Ugandan to work in Sudan. I think that's something else we need to also be thinking about. Non-tariff barriers, again tied into broader questions of political instability, but the development of infrastructure, which will facilitate better security and will also encourage migration and mobility of human capital from one country into another.
And of course, I think that delegates at the BIASHARA 2024 conference in Kigali have highlighted, even President Paul Kagame has also said that it is imperative to relook the governance system and, of course, fix the internal politics of the continent that will eventually give the broader scope for the African Continental Free Trade Area. We're going to listen now to his excerpt subsequently, just to note that indeed the African Continental Free Trade Area promises to be a better agenda for Africa to strive at this time that the continent is making its voice heard, especially on international affairs, and we saw with the adhesion of many countries in the BRICS bloc. But then how can you boost your economic viability at the international level when internal economic integration is still a major problem? We're going to answer that subsequently, but I will invite us to listen to the Secretary General of the African Continental Free Trade Area in the person of Wamkele Mene, who highlighted, of course, the importance of this historical agenda, noting that it has the potential, the capacity to lift Africa out of poverty. Let's listen to him, and then we're going to continue with our discussions.
Over 400 million Africans live in extreme and moderate poverty. Trade and access to new markets is essential for us as Africans to reduce poverty. The AfCFTA, with its comprehensive and continental scope, offers Africa a path out of poverty through trade, where we intensify our efforts aimed at economic integration and laying the groundwork for a single continental market. I believe we enhance our opportunity as Africans to defeat extreme and moderate poverty. Your Excellency, President Kagame, you hosted the 10th extraordinary session of the Assembly of Heads of States and Government here in this very hall in 2018, as Minister Sibaizi noted, for the signing ceremony of the agreement establishing the AfCFTA. Since that day, 21st of March 2018, 48 countries have ratified the agreement establishing the AfCFTA. Negotiations of all the protocols have successfully been concluded and adopted by the Assembly of Heads of States and Government of the African Union. More importantly, commercially meaningful trade has commenced under the Guided Trade Initiative, which we launched in October 2022 with 7 countries at that time. This year, 39 countries will be trading under the Guided Trade Initiative, demonstrating commercially meaningful trade on the basis of the AfCFTA.
And of course, we see the potentials of the trade agreement. We want to comment on this with you, Professor MONDA. Let's look at, Wamkelemene highlighting that about 400 million Africans, of course, in abject poverty, and with this historic trade agreement having the potential to solve this poverty through a threat. So, in your own perspective, what are those, practicalities that can be inculcated in the governance system? Because it's about the governance structure that we can eventually eradicate some of these, challenges to make the scope very fertile for the real trading among African countries in Africa.
So I think I would analyze that in 3 main baskets, right? I think one is the broader question of governance structures. I think the second question is the issue that we've just talked about around political instability.
Sure.
But thirdly is the question of regulatory environments to shift and move these people out of poverty. And if I may start with regulatory environments, we find very archaic or very old-fashioned kind of models in terms of how African governments approach, business, approach the free market, approach the enforcement of contracts and taxation policies, double taxation policies. And also more broadly, I don't think enough has been done about addressing questions of rules of origin for products. Because if we're really going to have an African continental free trade area, we really need to see that production and investment on the continent. And unless we have a proper regulatory environments, proper governance structures, there is a risk of, other major exporters like China dumping their products into the African market and actually defeating the purpose of, the free trade area for investment and production and development of industry, of heavy industry and human capital on the continent. And then other question in terms of governance, I think we need a more progressive question or vision around mobility, right, of human capital. Because in economies that are stronger, I think, regional countries, we need to establish regional mechanisms where skills, goods and services can be freely and easily exchanged across across borders. And I think governance is a major inhibitor to this. And I'll give you the example of our airline industry, where we find a balkanization and a fragmentation of the African airline industry, where every one of the 54 countries want to have its own airline. And the market is very fragmented, and it's unrealistic for every country to fly 1 or 2 jets between borders. But that issue of governance, that broader vision of common market beyond this patchwork of nationalisms, I think is something that needs to be looked at from a governance standpoint.
Sure.
And also opening the open Africa Open Skies agreements, the Yamoussoukro Accords. How have the governance structures encouraged the ratification of the Yamoussoukro Accord, so that if you want to fly from Lagos to Nairobi, or from Entebbe to Douala, or from Yaoundé to Mbabane, right? It's easy, and we don't have all this fragmentation of airline markets. So I think governance is another question, regulatory environments. But I think then the last issue in terms of raising all these people out of poverty and encouraging growth and investment, I think, is dealing with strengthening regional economic community frameworks and governance systems, because I think that was really, really ideal. We know, for example, of the excellent model we've had with ECOWAS, with the leadership of Ghana and Nigeria in terms of that community, of intervening in countries where there's been poor governance systems, or a democratic backsliding, the way ECOWAS was able to intervene in Liberia, for example, and address some of the challenges there, and also, for example, in Sierra Leone and other regional frameworks. And I think that similar models should be applied to areas like the DRC, where we've tended to have these continual political problems. So I'd really highlight it in terms of those three broad baskets: questions of regulatory environments, improving those to lift people out of poverty, areas of the questions of regional economic communities, ensuring that regional economic communities are enhanced, but also questions of governance, right? Having broader visions just beyond Kenya or beyond Nigeria or Cameroon, thinking more broadly about how these, smaller economies can also become markets for larger economies, but larger economies can also become markets for smaller economies in terms of product specialization and skills. So I really think there's really a need for better imagined governance issues and structures, for dealing with issues of mobility and issues of regulatory environments, but I think more importantly, helping and improving the regional economic community infrastructure to deal with not the problems of economic problem of each region, but also to deal with the security challenges that we have in the different areas.
Indeed, and of course, solving the internal, conflicts within Africa will be already a major milestone towards ensuring this economic integration. And now, let's look at, the place of the informal sector with you, Mr. OWUSU, in, addressing this conference. President Paul Kagame actually gave a clarion call to his peers and other stakeholders to give priority to small and medium-sized enterprises in the quest to ensure this solidify economic integration across Africa. So let's look at the feasibility and the practicality, or maybe parameters that we can use to fully inculcate the informal sector that makes a bulk of Africa's economies into the reality of the African Continental Free Trade Area to eventually mark that summit or the milestone.
Yeah, thank you very much for the question. Firstly, I would like to state that often Africa has the informal sector to be one of the largest, because in many countries, these sectors or the informal sector is not, this is something you've not captured. This is not something you have not formalized. So it's even very difficult to know the size. And I believe that the size is even bigger than it is estimated to be. Now, some time back, I was discussing the issue of border economies. So if you go to the border between Tanzania and Kenya, you realize that there is a whole big informal sector around the border, or the boundaries between the two countries. If you came to Ghana and Burkina Faso, as I mentioned, Nigeria and Benin, Nigeria and Cameroon, you realize that the people, because our borders were artificially created, it was not de facto, it was de jure, they sat in Berlin and they divided Africa. And so most of these borders run through ethnic groups that have lived for centuries and have and had their own form of economic life. So the existence of these borders at the dawn of independence did not really separate the people. In fact, it actually created some kind of formal boundaries. And so this informal sector is huge and must therefore be regularized or be formalized in order to get them captured. Because then, if that sector is not formalized, how do people access credit? And credit is important if people are going to benefit from AfCFTA.
Yeah.
Free trade, and especially when it comes to smaller and medium-scale businesses, you need that capital, you need that support, you need those financial education and financial literacy. But firstly, you need to identify how many people are in there. If we are saying that we want to lift 400 million people from poverty, most of those in poverty are people in the informal sector. And so we need to really have formal structures that brings them on board and then give them the necessary help. How do you help people you do not know?
Indeed.
You know they exist, but you do not know the size, you do not know the demographics, especially when it comes to women. We know with the border between Togo and Ghana, how women are very active in the economic lives in these areas. And again, we move to security. The informal, when it is captured, the use of that sector to promote illicit trade can be kept. So arms trade, drugs, which is becoming, the drug menace is becoming a major problem for Africa.
Indeed.
In West Africa, we find drug lords in Southern America using West Africa as transit zone. And consequently, it leads to the use of drugs in these countries, destroying the youth. And most of these drugs go through the informal sectors. In East Africa, we have the issue of heroin becoming a major problem. And so you look at all that and you realize that the more we agree that we have an informal sector, the more the agency to formalize it.
Yeah.
Sometimes some people feel that if you formalize it, it becomes a burden to the authorities. Because then if you know that if you formalize it, then it means you have to do something about them. So some people that leave them, they have lived that way for a long time. When you leave them, they survive on their own. But in fact, if we really want free trade agreement that has maximum impact or optimum impact, then we really need to formalize all the sectors. In the 21st century, where we are using mobile money, we are using technology and other services, it is only the formalization of all the sectors that would result in something good for the rest of the continent, especially for smaller economies. When this issue of free trade happened, many smaller economies who relied so much on revenue, that is taxes on imported goods, were very worried that, look, majority or a big chunk of my revenue comes from these taxes. So if you are asking me to remove all these tariffs, how do I survive? And that is where you need the bigger economies, or the bigger economies need to come on board to actually lead to, agree on some equitable structure that make smaller economies comfortable.
Sure.
And in all these, we are still talking about the informal sector. So if a majority of the sector or a big chunk of the sector is not formalized, how do you even reach some of these decisions to have the right impact? So these are very important. Again, we have a continent that is the youngest in the world. It means young people enterprising young people who want to enter into business are so many across the continent. And these young men and women can only enter in the smaller or the small and medium scale businesses. They cannot start building Microsoft or start building Dangote kind of businesses all of a sudden. They will have to start as small scale businesses. So we need to capture all these places, make sure that there are packages. We have young people with brilliant business ideas, that can become future Microsoft, future Facebook and other, Meta and other businesses, but they will need to be supported. And that is why we have to prioritize the small and medium scale enterprises and then make them the bigger platform based on which
major strategic goals could be reached.
Indeed. Very imperative just to remind our viewers tuning in that this is Global Insight on For You Media Africa, your discursive program, and we are live on YouTube and Facebook For You Media Africa English. You can leave your comments on, of course, a topic for discussion this day. What do you think about this BIASHARA Summit, the second edition, and of course, what age for the AfCFTA as leaders continue to show interest in bringing about the economic unity of the continent for its better, positioning in the ever-changing world. In line with what you just underlined, Mr. OWUSU, I would love to, of course, now bring this question to you, Professor MONDA, and maybe it will go a long way to some sort of the regulatory environment which you just mentioned earlier on. We are looking here at the role of the Afrexim Bank and even the African Development Bank in trying to inculcate the informal sector under the banner of the the AfCFTA, and of course how these bodies can eventually help to solve the problem of poverty that will reduce the number which was just highlighted by the Secretary General of the AfCFTA Secretariat.
Okay. So what's your question?
The role of the the Afrexim Bank and the African Development Bank in, of course, inculcating the informal sector and, of course, trying to facelift the small and medium-sized enterprises into thriving under the AfCFTA to reduce, of course, the numbers which were highlighted earlier on by the Secretary General of the African Continental Free Trade Area.
So I think two things. If you're talking about the banks, right, like Afrexim, like the ADB, African Development Bank, right?
Yeah.
I think, and my colleague also mentioned this, the informal sector and how do you regularize the informal sector. And part of the challenge with a lot of our banking and financing for small businesses is we still have a very colonial structure and a very elite-centered structure in terms of banking. So a lot of the informal sector that we're talking about is unbanked, right? These are people who don't have checking accounts or savings accounts, and a range of reasons why they don't have those. One is, they can't afford to have them, and two, the banks have just not reached out to them. And for a range of governance reasons, a lot of small businesses in Africa don't want to be formalized because it's a governance question. They don't want to pay extra taxes because they don't see the value of those taxes in the countries in which they reside. So I think, again, if we can sort out the governance issues so that there's proper governance and people across both sides of a border can see, it's actually an incentive for me to pay the taxes because I can get tax relief, I can get credit, I can get banked. I think that will be a very important step in terms of banking these people, of integrating the banking sector, the financial sector, and enabling these small and medium enterprises to access credit, which I think is another important element. But I think a more broader structural problem is a lot of our lending institutions on the continent, are still not African owned. Right, a major shareholding of the ADB, African Development Bank, is with the US and the EU and Japan. So until Africa actually, African countries significantly start to invest in themselves and create credit pools to enable business to grow and to bank large sections of the African population which is unbanked, we're going to continue to have a lot of these challenges because as my previous colleague has mentioned, until these people actually get into the formal structure, right? You start to pay payroll taxes, get into the formal economic stream. It's very difficult, one, for government to generate revenue from taxation, two, to give people taxation incentives to be able to grow their businesses, but three, in terms of planning, government doesn't really know how many people engage in business, with a volume of business that's going on. So planning is also a major challenge. So I think structurally, for a lot of these major banking institutions that you mentioned, I think African governments need to reimagine how we're going to fund our own capacities. And I say that not only thinking about Africa, because we can't talk about African free trade area without thinking about the global environment.
Sure.
And one of the ways I would think structurally some of our African finance institutions can be better funded would be, say, through the global south. We have major partners in the developing world.
Mm-hmm.
You have countries like Brazil, you have giants like South Africa, Nigeria, India, China, of course, right? Saudi Arabia, that can actually provide alternative pooling and financing for a lot of for a lot of these small and medium enterprises. But I think one last point I'd just like to make, really quickly. I think another element, as we talk about African free trade area, we really need to also start thinking about making the international financial system fairer and more equitable for Africa. Because currently, the global financial infrastructure is really modeled on a Bretton Woods system, which is a 1945 post-World War II system. And many African countries didn't exist in 1945. Yeah. Most of all of Sub-Saharan Africa was under colonialism. So, credit rating for a lot of our countries is still a very it's not a transparent system, maybe around Moody's, Standard & Poor's, and so on. And also in terms of financing, how we're going to get financing from abroad to actually do some of this integration, right? Sure. A lot of the financing, particularly from Western, European, and US companies, and the IMF and World Bank is usually very expensive. So I think those are, if Africa can negotiate as a bloc in terms of accessing of credit and democratizing, making the global financial systems more equitable, I think that would be very important, because you cannot talk about integrating Africa outside of, of reforming the global financial and banking structures.
Indeed. And which, of course, you just answered some of the questions we were to reach, and of course, seeing how the BRICS bloc and other countries in the global south can help to reshape the financial or maybe global financial architecture that will instead give a greater or a broader scope for the African continent. Let's take a break again by listening to the excerpt of President Paul Kagame of Rwanda, who actually highlighted that there is need for the mindset to change around politics, around governance, if we want, of course, to see the Africa we want under the African continental free trade area.
We need to fix our politics, our governance. And it all begins with mindset and clarity of vision. Like when people talk about AfCFTA and intra-African trade, how low it is, and so on and so forth, the first thing that comes to mind is lack of free movement. Why should there be anything like that? Why shouldn't there be free movement of people, goods and services. Why? Why shouldn't people of one country freely move across the border to another country, across the whole continent? What is the issue? In the end, we agree we are brothers and sisters and same people that have same needs. But in the end, the lack of this freedom of people to move freely, well, I'm talking about moving freely across borders. Some people don't move freely within their own borders. And it really is all about politics that can be fixed, and we must fix it. We now live in a complex and ever-changing world. But there are a lot of opportunities for us to take advantage of. As a continent, how well we adapt will depend on how strongly connected we are and on the value we add to our collective wealth. The good news is that integration in Africa is ongoing, and already we can see positive results. But we can do more, and we can do faster, go faster. Over 30 countries are now participating in the Guided Trade Initiative. Rwanda is happy to be among the first countries to join this pilot. Governments need to continue doing their part to create an enabling environment for business. Removing non-tariff barriers should remain a priority, as well as facilitating cross-border movement. Reducing freight, logistics, and logistic costs would also be a game changer. Africa has some of the highest in the world. The costs of freight and logistics, that is.
Of course, he ended, of course, with those challenges which are impeding the trajectory for the African continental free trade area. Why? Of course, like President Kagame has just asked us now. And then we want to come to answer the why by seeing how, you know, the BRICS bloc can come in here. With you, Mr. OWUSU, how do you think now with this BRICS bloc that is trying to, you know, to change the patterns, especially of the economic setting of the global world, and we also see that the African countries are adhering to this bloc. It provides indeed a greater opportunity for greater exploits. So now let's see how this bloc can help Africa in solving some of these challenges, particularly in making strong economic decisions at the international arena that will transcend to internal policies in the continent.
At the micro level, I want to make an analogy. Whenever there is competition, economic competition in a country, for instance, in Ghana some time ago, we had a state telecommunication company exercising monopoly on telecommunication. And at that time, you could not afford to buy SIM card that same that you use in your phone, you could not afford. Then we saw competition. Other companies came in, and when they came in, we saw a drastic reduction in the cost of this SIM and other cost of data and credit and all that. That is what competition produces. When there is competition, the consumer is almost always a beneficiary of that environment or competitive environment. The same thing applies to international regimes. So you have the Bretton Woods institution, and now the BRICS, led by China, India, Russia, South Africa, and Brazil. And you realize that they are offering alternative sources of funding or alternative economic environment that may not be offered elsewhere. So if you look at the bigger picture, there is nothing wrong with BRICS. And so if the African state decide to subscribe to it, that is fine. Excuse me. However, I have always argued that the solution to the problems in Africa is not outside Africa, is inside Africa. We must prioritize our integration before prioritizing our zeal or prioritizing our effort to join any such group. Yes, China has been a good partner for providing funds for infrastructure development and what have you. However, until Africa joins itself, joining any other bloc outside may not lead to the right results that we expect.
Sure.
So, just as President Kagame is mentioning, until the borders between, I can move to Togo without any stress, move to Nigeria and decide to relocate to Nigeria to practice whatever I'm practicing today in Ghana, until I can drive all the way to Kampala without any major impediment. Whether we join BRICS or not will not lead to anything substantial. If we do not remove those blocks, if we do not empower our own people, China's interest is not to empower Africans. Its interest is to draw that partnership that allows it to feed its industries in its metropolis. How to get the resources, the Belt and Silk Road that is being championed is to get these resources. Similarly, European powers want African resources. They want to access African markets. And we saw what the EPA, where Europe decided to negotiate individually with African states to form that economic partnership agreement that was not going to inure to the individual interest of African states. And at the time, some of us were asking that we have to negotiate en bloc, as Prof mentioned earlier, that when we have that kind of, we synchronize our interest and negotiate as a bloc, we stand a better chance to get what we need from these powers. Ghana negotiating with China, which has one of its cities having a bigger economy than the whole country of Ghana, doesn't make sense. You need that weight of Nigeria, that of Algeria, South Africa, Ethiopia, Kenya, to all come together for such negotiations to be beneficial to the continent. So, like the president of Rwanda mentioned, we keep repeating the same things. Why can't we move? Why can't we move from one country to another?
Yeah.
We keep asking ourselves, like, nobody is willing to actually make it, realize it by removing these barriers, in fact. And so we will keep talking about it. So we have to get our act together within the continent. That is the only time that we can really benefit from any agreement we have with external actors. Until then, it will be difficult, whether be it BRICS, we've joined organizations, we've formed groups.
even within Africa, we have so many groups, within groups. But the one thing is that joining a fora is different from realizing substantial benefit or substantial benefit from it.
Absolutely, yeah.
And so it is very important that we get our acts together internally, and that is only when we can benefit from any association from without. Thank you.
Bringing us to the question of the political will in all of these, and of course, I know we've always talked about Africa's competitive advantage or intelligence in the face of the changing global dynamics, particularly at the economic level. And we want to look at the age for the continent under the Continental Free Trade Area. Let's answer this question with you, Professor MONDA. Apparently, it's still the political will that is derailing every, every move by countries in Africa to ensure this economic integration. And this also brings us to the role of the African Union, because it is what, it's binding the African continent together. How can we, bring about a strong political will that will prioritize the interests of the continent for it to benefit, like Mr. AWUSU underlined, from such organizations like the BRICS and others?
So this is a difficult question. It will have to be addressed in terms of the individual governance and leaders. It will have to be addressed within global international players, but it will also have to be addressed within the countries themselves in terms of who they elect to lead those countries. Yeah. So let's give the example of President Kagame, who you highlighted on this forum. Rwanda today has very bad relations with the DRC, right? It's very adversarial. And there is a security, a political, and a diplomatic angle to the challenges of the relationship between the DRC and Rwanda. And I say that because Rwanda is very much deeply involved in a lot of the civil war in the eastern DRC, because Rwanda has been on record through UN inspections, through a range of research on this question of extracting a lot of the wealth, whether it's gold, coltan, manganese, silver from the DRC, timber, through Rwanda for export. And I think this is fundamental question that needs to be addressed, that creates these problems, because if Rwanda is using proxies like M23 in the DRC to extract these resources, it creates these what we'd call economies of violence, right? So violence is perpetuated because there's certain actors that benefit from that violence. So it's difficult to have peace. I think similarly, from Kinshasa's point of view, the DRC is no angel in this whole regional instability question. Absolutely. Because the DRC has also supported FDLR, groups that also affect the security of Rwanda. So there's a governance question there, and I think the two leaders, Kinshasa and Kigali, need to sit together and iron some of these differences out. And you can see a similar thing playing out between Ethiopia and Somalia. Say on the question of Somaliland and some of the leadership challenges that happen between Addis Ababa, for example, and Mogadishu. So you cannot do regional integration and make high speeches about how Africa needs to come together when regional neighbors are undermining each other. This is really, really a fundamental problem from our heads of state on the continent.
Indeed. a fundamental problem indeed. Just to note that during this year's African Union Summit, we saw, of course, these issues which you just mentioned coming again to the limelight, and we begin to ask, how can we solve this? And of course, through political will, then what is making it difficult for us to attain already that milestone? It is now the place of BIASHARA and other fora to continue to discuss, like the stakeholders have noted that even President Kagame, that we are actually conversant of the challenges, but then there is still that one thing that is killing us, stopping us from taking a step ahead, and of course making Africa not to really define that it's a competitive edge at the decision-making table on issues that concern the continent. How can we do this with the fragmented nature of the continent, be it economic, political, and otherwise? And this is why today we again started come to give importance or relevance to the historic Continental Free Trade Area Agreement, and asking if all of these conferences can actually take us to that level, knowing fully well that we have internal strife in the continent that actually impediment or real impediment to the practical realization of the historic trade agreements to suit the changing times. And this is now where we will look at the aspect of policy alignment in coming to you, Mr. OWUSU, and your own perspective. What do you think are those necessary steps to be taken for policy alignment in terms of, within Africa and even at the external level, with particularly the BRICS nations and other, organizations or bodies indulged in the economic life of the African continent that can eventually or effectively lead us to meeting the major objective of the African Continental Free Trade Area, having the Africa we want, spelled by the African Union Agenda 2063.
Thank you very much for the question. Firstly, I would like to say that when it comes to the issue of policy alignment, it has always been the bane of Africa, right from independence, when Nkrumah and others were advocating for a radical move towards unity. Others thought that no, that is too early. They needed to be gradual in their approach. So led by Julius Nyerere of Tanzania, they felt that they were known as the gradualists. They felt that no, that is too radical to do. And that was a point of departure. And that meant that the policies were not aligning, that Ghana and others thought that they were ready to unite and to have that kind of economic integration that we are currently fighting for. However, others felt that, well, we are too young, we have to get our acts together, we have to make sure that we know what we are doing, let's take our time so that we don't, hit the rock, and things like that were mentioned. Currently, we've gone round and come back to the realization that we still have to integrate our economies. We still have to have some policy alignment. But what I said, that the economies are not the same. Africa is the largest continent with the largest number of countries, and the second largest continent, landmass on Earth. Now, if you look at the continent, you realize that the 54 sovereign states all have different sizes of economies. Some of them are really lagging behind. Talk about Niger, talk of Sierra Leone, talk of Malawi, talk of Somalia. These are countries that are really, really, really down there in terms of the economic development. They are really struggling. And others are doing well. Others are not doing so well, but have the potential to do well. An example is the Democratic Republic of the Congo. It has all the resources you can think about, but because of instability and that infrastructure deficit, they are not able to develop as it should be.
it has the 4th largest population in the continent. That's the DRC. However, because of instability, it is not part of the first 5 economies in the continent, but it has all the resources. It has oil, it has cobalt, all the rare earth. You are talking about all the metals needed in Silicon Valley in the manufacture of electronics and other gadgets like the iPhones and the Samsung phones that people talk about, if I'm not advertising them right here. But then you are talking about a country with so much potential, but still having economic problems. And so all these differences make the synchronization or the alignment of policies difficult. When is every country going to be on the same pedestal in order to agree that this is where we have to go? But the thing is, are we going to wait for all countries to be on that level before we move? No, we cannot. Because even in the European Union, where poverty is not that widespread, countries had to decide that we are starting. So Benelux in the 50s and the 60s, Benelux, Belgium, Netherlands, and Luxembourg started this European Union project. And these are countries that do not have the largest economies in Europe. But when they started it, and others saw that, well, we fought against ourselves for too long as Europeans, for centuries. This is the time after the Second World War, this is the time for us to really put all the hard power politics aside and choose economic integration, economic progress, and political integration. And it was started by these 3 smaller countries, Belgium, Netherlands, and Luxembourg. When you put the 3 economies together, they are not up to half of Germany's economy. But they started it and others joined. So I think that we cannot have this alignment happening overnight. We must start from somewhere, and others, knowing that they will be lagging behind, will be in a hurry to do the necessary internal arrangement that will put them in a better position to join the rest who are moving ahead. That is what I see. Because the continent is too big. It's bigger than Europe. We cannot expect that overnight everybody will be ready to be part of this big project that we need to embark on to help the generations yet unborn. Now, it is only that we can have that kind of respect, that kind of attention, urgent attention that we need outside the continent. Sure. China is in Africa, the United States is in Africa, the Russians, everyone is coming. However, they are going to take it more seriously when they see that we can come together and fight for our interests. So you're talking of climate change, you're talking of fair trade, you're talking about political synchronization, economic synchronization. These are all things that will be taken seriously when external interests see that, well, Africans are ready and they have a single voice to push their interests. Indeed. Thank you.
Indeed, in this world, it's about interest, and of course, we'll always reverberate on this platform asking the question, what is Africa's competitive advantage or intelligence in the changing times? The continent with mineral resources, with the human capital, yet a continent that is lacking behind in terms of development, infrastructure in every dimension. So now, how can we, of course, use these valuables that we have to, give a new face to Africa that we want, of course, like it is underlined in the BIASHARA 2024, dare to invent the Africa we want. And this is where I'm bringing us back to the question, a point that Mr. Owusu just underlined earlier on with you, Professor Monda. We're looking at the 21st century conquest for the continent Africa and how this is, affecting the economic integration of the continent. He mentioned that, the Americans and the other countries vying to have, to create cooperation, bilateral cooperations with the African continent. some months ago, there was a report circulating about, U.S. officials underlining the need for the U.S. to come into Africa and ensure that the secure mineral resources that will help in the production of batteries for vehicles, and of course many other aspects which are quite present across the African continent. Now, this is, of course, where we need to bring in again this issue of policy alignment that can, counteract the external interest, especially having external interest that has a negative impact on the economic trajectory of the African continent, especially in terms of preserving the natural resources of the continent for present and future use.
Yeah, so I think my contribution on that would be to say, within the continent, something that we really need to re-emphasize is duplication of memberships in terms of regional economic communities. I think that's something African countries need to re-emphasize and sort out. So, for example, I'll give you the case in East Africa of Tanzania. So Tanzania is a member of both SADC, of COMESA, and is also a member of the East African Community. So when you have a lot of these overlapping memberships, the commitment of a country, its capacity intellectually, institutionally, human resource-wise, and in terms of political will, becomes a challenge. So I think that's also something African countries need to think about more broadly when we're thinking about integrating in terms of the African Free Trade Area. When a country has multiple memberships and is not even effective within its most important regional relationships, I think this doesn't really help the broader narrative and vision of a united Africa.
Thank you so much. And of course, Mr. Owusu, we still have some 5 minutes to be together. And of course, looking at the way forward recommendations, what do you think it's the role of, major stakeholders at the decision-making table, particularly the African Union, towards, meeting this objective of the continental free trade area, especially on areas of, capacity building and even the products that the continent can trade, of course, the diversification of products. I beg your pardon.
So when the founding fathers of Africa were advocating for African unity at the time, and I always repeat this, European Union was at its infancy. It was at its infancy, and African leaders were already thinking about unity. We were able to achieve it. Currently, we have the African Continental Free Trade Agreement. We must take this seriously. It is a watershed agreement in the history of Africa. We cannot downplay it. We should make it work. And I will urge the youth like myself to take this seriously, because it is an opportunity we cannot let slide. Because if we let it go, it will take a longer time for us to get it back. So we must utilize it, we must push it, and we must make it work. We must make sure that we, unlike our forebears, we are able to integrate Africa, create a common market, a common economy that helps us compete. It is only that will help our generations yet unborn to benefit in the African project. Other than that, we would have these discussions over and over again, and we gain nothing from it. And as I've mentioned, in so doing, we must allow our giants in everything. There must be leadership. Our giants, the Nigerians, South Africa, Ethiopia, Egypt, Algeria, Morocco, Kenya, others that have relatively bigger economies to lead. There is no need to have personality clashes among leaders.
Yeah.
But
the most important thing is that we create the necessary security environment.
Environment, indeed.
Because if goods must move from one place to the other, they must move in a peaceful environment. Thank you very much.
Which is very imperative. Thank you so much, Mr. Awusu, for the great insight, and also to you, Professor David Monda, for your time, and of course the analysis on the topic for discussion this day, which boils down to the fact that it all will warrant a strong political will from African leaders. It will need a compromise, real collaboration to be able to attain the continental agenda under the historic African continental free trade area. And it is time, of course, to advocate for African solutions to African problems, to, of course, make a better scope for the continent in the ever-changing and challenging world, to define a greater environment for the world of multipolarity, and also have a voice to say at the economic stage. Thank you so much, ladies and gentlemen. We appreciate your time, but this is not all. Keep having a lovely moment in the company of programs on For You Media Africa. Bye-bye.